Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast about women and women first. My name is Sovereign Syre. I am a writer, a comedian, and just like other girls. Every last one. I am just like other girls.
What the do you have a problem with about other girls? I'm Ela Darling. I used to be a librarian. I am still writing the coattails of my own porn star career. I'm an erstwhile virtual reality entrepreneur and pioneer and all that. And I am Satyr Bard, level 8, I think. I have Mirthful Leap, and I have really cool horns. My character's name is Pepsi Maxton. That's a different video situation, but I thought it was relevant just because she lives in my heart.
I just put on my boots of escapement.
Your rocket pack of get me the out of this narrative. I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming into a D&D campaign. Come holler, high water.
Yes. So we here at Ill Repute, we support women's rights.
But more importantly, we support women's wrongs.
And whose women's wrongs are we writing today, Miss Ela Darling?
Oh, Calamity Jane, Martha Jane Canary, Crazy Jane of the Rolling Scum.
Yes. So when we left off, we had told the story of Jane as a kid. Her family took her on the Oregon Trail. They took the Bozeman Trail up to Virginia City, Montana. She was orphaned there. She spent some time riding the rails. She became a sex worker. She became a scout. She became really fucking famous. She became famous, but she had no idea because she was illiterate and not really keeping abreast of the papers and what was being said about her. And so she was still just living her life as a reckless lady. She did some scouting. She potentially did some outlawing. She potentially saved a general's life, according to him. Got the name Calamity Jane. She met Wild Bill Hickok when she got kicked out of yet another town. And they were among the first people to arrive in Deadwood, very famous city now. And then after Wild Bill's assassination, she went a little loosey-goosey. She was running around with the outlaws. It was a time when it was incredibly violent, incredibly dangerous place to live. And when she got done being wild and crazy, she decided she was going to settle down and be a normal lady. She met a guy. They were running a ranch. She had a baby. She was like, I'm doing the thing. And then that baby passed away. And then she was like, never mind, everybody, I'm out. Mm-hmm. And she just kind of went on a tear. She met an abusive guy. They had a very volatile relationship, very abusive, but they had a baby girl, Jessie, that Jane loved helplessly. She went back to her sister's place. She tried to live a straight and normal life. And eventually she heard that other old timers from the Old West were making lots of money doing these things called like Wild West shows. And she's like, I want to get on one of those. So she comes back to Deadwood after being gone for 10 years. And she gets on at one. She does a little tour. She gets to dress up in a fancy clothes. She's working with like Houdini and like Tom Thumb. Like she's part of these dime museum tours. And then her daughter writes her and says, I'm sick and they're bullying me. And she drops everything and she goes back to Deadwood. She takes her daughter, yanks her out of there, and is going to get her someplace safe. And at that time, she's with another husband and really good guy. They got in a fight and he took her daughter away and took her daughter to his parents and said, you need to take care of this girl. Her mom's a drunk. Can't do it. And they did. And they took care of that girl for the rest of her life. Jane, while she was on that tour, had learned a thing or two. So she couldn't read or write, but she had someone write her life story. It was a 3-page pamphlet. She had a bunch of professional photos taken of her in a gown and in her buckskin suit. And she got the first permit 001, to display in Yellowstone Park, the only human natural wonder, and was allowed to sell her pictures and her autograph and made a ton of money doing that. And at that point realized that she could pay for drinks, hotels, and lodging simply by giving away signed photos of herself. So she is having a time. And then she gets her drinking is getting out of control. And she finally ends up getting so sick on a train that she is taken to the poorhouse, which for her was incredibly embarrassing. And word went out to everyone that Calamity Jane was in the poorhouse and dying. And all the old stagecoach gentry gathered their money, were sending her money to like get her out. And it was all over the news wires. And what had happened is a woman named Josephine Brake, who was in Buffalo, New York, a journalist, read that Jane was in the poorhouse and decided that she had a plan. And that is where we start part 5.
I love a woman with a plan.
I have ambivalent feelings for Josephine Brake, but the main feeling is baller.
Nice.
Josephine Brake was from New York, but she was staying in Buffalo where the Pan American Exposition was going. This was a big World's Fair, so like everybody's there. And so she is ostensibly there to also participate, report on, write about, and visit the amazing Pan American Exposition. And this is when she gets the news about Jane. So we begin in 1901, the Pan American Exposition.
The Pan American Exposition was a large-scale international exhibition held in Buffalo, New York, as you said, in 1901. It showcased the achievements, innovations, and cultural contributions of the Americas and marked the progress of the Western Hemisphere in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The exposition attracted millions of visitors and featured impressive architecture, technological displays, cultural exhibits, and entertainment.
Sounds like a pretty good time.
When did this happen in comparison to the World Fair in Chicago, I think?
Okay, so the Chicago World's Fair happened, don't quote me on this, but it happened in the 1890s.
Okay.
Or the late 1880s, but I believe it was the 1890s. Because when these world fairs would take place, it would take years.
Okay.
It was kind of like the Olympics. Like towns would compete to be the location.
Mm-hmm.
And then once the location was made, like you had to build out a whole city. So from them finding out that their town is picked to the thing being constructed to it opening and people actually coming in could take 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
I believe it was 1893. And when that happened and the popularity of it, then that's when it really kicked off as like, this is a thing that we're going to do. And so at this time, Buffalo was not what we think of it as today. Buffalo was like, it was sort of like the Hamptons. So Buffalo had become the place where the literati, the socialites, everybody else, because it's right by Niagara Falls. Mm-hmm. Buffalo at this time, like Samuel Clemens had lived there. Mm-hmm. It had like 5 papers. It had one of the biggest papers there. I'm forgetting the exact name of it. But the compound for the paper took up like a full city block, right? Mm-hmm. That had huge mansions. It had a millionaire's row that was known for sort of wild sex parties. Mm-hmm. And like sort of the young wealthy. Imagine it very much like, say, the Hamptons or Aspen. It's a destination location. It's really has a lot of natural beauty. And really only very wealthy people can afford to be there. But for the World's Fair, like everyone's gonna like show up. And the reason this was possible and the Chicago World's Fair was possible was because of the Transcontinental Railroad had made it so that people from all over the country could get to Chicago or get to Buffalo at most in like a couple days. So that heavily increased the amount of people that could be there. And we tend to think of the past in a certain way, but there were already millions and millions of people in the United States at this point. And they loved to go see shit like this. It was like the Super Bowl. I mean, are you going to the fair? You're going to go see it, right? And so the expositions would stay open for like 3 to 6 months to allow people. And the displays were crazy. I know that at this World's Fair, they debuted incubators for premature infants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they had like a little train that would like take you through the whole thing. They had literally built a canal system like in Venice so they could take people on boats. This was a very big deal. And the biggest deal about it was that Thomas Edison had designed all of the buildings with lights so that they would light up at dark. They called it the Rainbow City because it was like all these different colors. But there's existent video of Thomas Edison like lighting it up so it was electrified at night. And that was its big draw, is that you could stay all night because it was lit up. And it had a huge Ferris wheel. Those were the big draws at the Pan American.
Part of why it took so long to set up is because a lot of the really big innovations that were on display were things that had to be constructed on site that were it's sometimes just sort of calculated before they got there. There just wasn't the money, the resources, the ability, the space to craft something and port it over the way that we might today. When I think of something like this, I think of conventions and conferences that either are huge hubs or just kind of tour. But this would be something that some of the biggest innovations of the time, flushing toilets, I think, as we finally adopted them, like the last rendition of flushing toilets were on display there. So given all of that, it was also obviously a really big social space in a country that is now millions and millions. The movers and shakers were there. So what did that mean for someone like Jane?
It wasn't on her radar, right?
Okay.
Like she's just out there being a crazy lady. But Josephine, right? It was a very big deal. And we'll get into why it was a big deal for her. But she had some social losses that she needed to recoup. And this was a place to do it. And we'll see as we move on, like who greets Jane and Josephine when they get back from Montana is essentially like being greeted by like Maya Angelou and like Barack Obama. It's just like the people that Josephine was connected with. So the Pan American the idea of it was to promote trade, diplomacy, mutual understanding between North, South, Central, South American nations, things like that. It took place over 350 acres to give you a sense of scale. When they would do these fairs, would build an entire city with a city's infrastructure. So bathrooms, food courts, lodging, police force, security, merchandising, transportation, public transit. This was building a whole new town from scratch in like under a couple of years.
You said that was 350 acres? Mm-hmm. So for our American listeners, that is 265 football fields.
Insane. It would take a family would go there and it was it would take them 3 to 4 days to be able to see everything.
Oh.
They had just invented the instant camera.
Right.
So Kodak had just done that. So that was like a big thing. It was like one of the first World's Fairs where you were seeing lots of snapshots that people could take by themselves. So the Chicago World's Fair was called the White City because what they had done is all the buildings were white. And they were all like, it was pastiche. It was a Potemkin village, right? So this one was like Beaux Arts and everything was painted like rainbow colors. So it was the Rainbow City. The big attraction was that all the buildings were lit up. There were like thousands of lights on each building and it was illuminated at night. And that was a new wonder. Like they had like street lamps and stuff, but to this level of electric light, crazy. And so I included a YouTube video so you could, there's extant video from 1901 at night so you can see what this looked like.
This is so fucking cool.
Yeah, like I could watch it over and over again.
I mean, it looks fake.
Okay. Doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
The Pan American Exposition showcased a wide variety of attractions, including technological innovations, agricultural displays, art exhibitions, live performances, and ethnographic displays that celebrated the cultures of the Americas. That sounds ominous.
There was a Japanese or Chinese island that had like Japanese gardens and things like that.
It's not the gardens that concerns me, Sovereign. It's the ethnographic displays.
But this time, that's how things were described because this was a very much age of enlightenment. Everything can be classified. Physiognomy is real.
Right.
They were essentially human zoos.
Okay. Yeah. The birth of pathology. Everything is pathology. Everything that deviates from being a white man. Which we'll touch on that in a future episode. I have a lot to say.
Yes.
So similar to other World's Fairs and expositions, the Pan American Expo featured an amusement area known as the Midway. This section had rides, games, and entertainment to attract and entertain visitors. That sounds so fucking cool.
Yeah.
And dangerous.
So there was also there would be a thing called the Indian Village. So this guy, Frederick Cummins, had the Indian Congress, and I think he had something like 700 players. And they would essentially set up shop on the Midway and create an Indian village. They would put up teepees. They would set everything up the way they would if they were out on the plains. They would be in their teepees. They would be out. They would be singing songs. They would be cooking, just living life as they would. And visitors could like walk through it and experience that and get to see people sort of, and the impulse at the time was educational and people thought they were being respectful. They thought they were being intellectuals and being intellectually curious and being very open-minded, getting to see people like in their natural environments and kind of appreciate how they live their lives. But the Indian village could be a wild place. There could be drinking. There could be fucking. There could be dance. You know what I mean? Like there's, and also on the Midway was the hoochie coochie. So the first strip teases was like the hoochie coochie dance. And they still have pictures of this that they used to put in viewfinders before they had, before you could do like a home movie.
Yeah.
So you'd also see like belly dancers.
Ooh.
Exotic dancers, like with their clothes not hauled away on. And that was a thing for gentlemen that wanted to let their wives go wander and shop in the women's building. They could go to the Midway and stroll through the hoochie coochie and perhaps walk amongst the Indian village and see some shirtless men,
Ooh.
So,
something for everyone.
Humans are going to human. And the rule of entertainment is that sex sells. And so if you have a bunch of native performers with hot bodies and they're exotic, they're different, and they're controlling horses, just harnessing that raw, masculine, muscular energy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe your wife wanted to go watch that.
Maybe your wife wanted to go and learn a lot about a culture that is presented in a very progressive way.
There's a very interesting economy that pops up. There's there's a bit of like a resort culture. There's a whole thing to it when you're a young man and you can walk around shirtless and you know that like these white ladies are going to be really into that and you can get sex and money and stuff. We tend to think of the past as this like very sanitized. And I'm hoping what we're getting through the Calamity Jane thing is like people was fucking.
Yeah.
People have always been fucking. When people get together in large groups, they be fucking. When white people encounter people of color, they be fucking. When people of color encounter white people, they be fucking. Like people be fucking. Because young people are just horny regardless of circumstances. And they're going to be doing fucking. They're going to be doing drinking. They're going to be drugging. They're going to be dancing. They're going to be doing all of it. And the way society was structured at this time is it's like the Pan American Exposition would have like all of its like very educational content and everything. But like the place everyone was really going was the Midway because they wanted to see the hoochie coochie dancers, which were belly dancers. Women at that time were not even showing their ankles. So it's important to understand that like a hoochie coochie dancer who's in like a bra and a veiled skirt, right? Like was hot stuff. You had to go in a special tent for that, right? And to see the native dudes shirtless running around, people weren't seeing that. But within this context, it was totally acceptable because it was educational.
It's like being at theater camp. You can just change in front of everybody because that's just the culture and the atmosphere.
So one of the most notable displays at the Pan American was the first electrified dark ride, which was called Voyage to the Moon. If that sounds familiar to you, Georges Méliès, who is the father of cinema, went to the Pan American and went on the Voyage to the Moon and was so struck by it that he said, I want to make a movie out of this. And so he took the plot of the ride and turned it into a film. So the first Pirates of the Caribbean. And that became the first film. And that was shown for the first time in 1902 in Los Angeles in the very first electric movie theater.
This unique and innovative attraction allowed visitors to experience a simulated journey to the moon through a combination of mechanical effects, theatrical elements, and visual illusions. The Voyage to the Moon ride was one of the early examples of dark rides, which are indoor amusement park attractions designed to immerse visitors in a themed environment.
Calamity Jane died in 1903, which was the same year that the Wright brothers took their first flight.
Hmm.
So if you really think about the context of like when she was born, the Pony Express existed because the railway only went to St. Joseph, Missouri. Like that's as far as you could go without being on horseback and doing it like on a wagon, like all by yourself.
Right.
And by the time she passed away, we were flying.
That's
When
incredible.
she was born, there were no phones. There
Yeah.
was no newswire. There was nothing. And by the time she died, we had cars. Someone had been killed in the first car accident. There was flight. There was electric movies. There was telephones. Like, I mean, just like what a person saw in their lifetime. I think that's what makes figures from this time period so interesting because they saw so much change so rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was probably one of the first generations that we can look back on as having lived through such a huge transition. I mean, you could argue that with the Industrial Revolution that started to happen, but it wasn't until we were able to really like have community across states with the railroad, with making it easier to just as a country be a unified country.
So Voyage to the Moon was housed within a building that featured a very carefully crafted and immersive environment resembling a spaceship or a capsule. Visitors would board the ride vehicle, which was designed to resemble like a lunar vehicle. I mean, this is 1901. Like
They didn't have
know.
those yet. They didn't have anything to go. They had no source material.
like the resources of human imagination.
Yeah.
The ride featured mechanical effects and motion simulation to create the illusion of movement and space travel.
Fuck.
They were so good. They used to have these things called cycloramas where they would just like these. I think I said this in the last one. They would recreate town floodings. They would recreate the Great London fires. And these were set over several acres and they would just flood a whole town so you could see a flood in person. Like, talk about practical effects.
The Indian Congress aimed to showcase the culture, traditions, and contributions of Native American tribes from across the United States and to provide visitors with a glimpse into the diverse Native American cultures of the time.
And here's a picture of Frederick T. Cummins
Okay.
with, I forget who he's with here, but with a Native player.
So I'll just describe the image. I'm going to make it real big real quick.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's a man with a formidable mustache, pretty standard cowboy hat. He's wearing, the duster, the buttoned up vest, like top and slacks and everything of the day. He looks very Western, and he is sitting with a native.
He looks Sioux or Lakota by his haircut, and because it's kind of and I don't think it was credited, but that by his haircut and everything else, he looks to be like Sioux or Lakota or Dakota.
It looks like the culturally appropriative, like great grandfather of a mullet with a lot more style, gravitas.
Yeah. I'll say this about Cummins. He had a child with a Native woman. He thought of himself very much as trying to be helpful and sharing the beauty of Native culture, and paid his players well. And, amongst the people doing these Wild West shows was one that definitely thought of himself as like an educator and as doing good. So, not that that's what happened, but intention and impact are both important. So,
White savior. Is that accurate?
Maybe. Businessman and hustler. That was trying to play fair. So I guess I relate to him a little bit.
Yeah.
Just like I'm a hustler first and foremost. I'm a hustler and a scammer before I'm anything else. But I do operate by rules of fairness. And so he didn't seem to be one that got off on exploiting or abusing the players under contract with him. The Trans-Mississippi International Exposition was a World's Fair style exposition that celebrated the progress and achievements of the Western United States and its territory. As part of this exposition, the Indian Congress was organized to provide an educational and cultural component that highlighted the Native American presence in the region.
Frederick T. Cummins was a journalist and advocate who had a strong interest in Native American issues and culture. He believed that the exposition should include an authentic representation of Native American life and traditions, which I can respect. Execution? I don't know yet, but like...
Yeah. And then here we've got a picture of him, you know,
he looks
as an older gentleman. So this is probably in like the 1910s, 1920s, because you can see he's significantly older than in the previous photo.
Right. It looks like a photograph. It could easily be from the 70s. The bed, the carpet, the walls, it looks like a shitty hotel that you would be hanging out in on tour, you know, during the day while they're like setting up and doing sound check. He looks dressed for the stage. He looks like he's about to play bass or do backup vocals for Willie Nelson. And I say that with respect.
He's got the arm gauntlets with the fringe. They've got daisies like embroidered on them.
Yeah, they've got flowers on him.
He looks super fuckable.
He's got thigh-high leather boots. Like, who's fucking who here?
Yeah, like he looks very fuckable. Like he's got this very kind of boy metrosexual kind of thing that male showmen do because they are naturally a little bit feminine.
Okay,
because they're about presentation.
You say that as a historian. I see this through the lens of today. He looks like he's groomed. He looks like a man. He looks like what all I ask of men aesthetically, like give a little bit of a he looks like he gives just a little bit of a shit about his appearance. He smells good. Yeah, he does, which for the time is the pinnacle of showmanship. Today, the pinnacle of showmanship is something far removed from that. The pinnacle of showmanship today is still, can you please at least look like you smell good?
We're still at the front of that battle, girl. Like most men I see walking down the street look like they smell like ass. When I like, here's a tip for the guys. If the guys are still listening at this point, if a girl ever comes up to you and says, "Oh, you smell good,"
she
is down to fuck, son.
She's already bouncing on your dick in her head.
So the Indian Congress featured participation from various Native American tribes representing different regions and cultures. These tribes set up encampments and demonstrated their traditional ways of life, including arts and crafts, dance, and music. The Indian Congress showcased a wide range of exhibits and demonstrations that provided visitors with insights into Native American culture. These included displays of traditional clothing, beadwork, basketry, pottery, weapons, tools, and other artifacts. Tribes also demonstrated their traditional dances, ceremonies, and crafts.
The Indian Congress at the 1898 Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition is recognized as one of the earliest efforts to bring Native American culture to a large audience through a public event. It set a precedent for later events and exhibitions that aimed to promote cross-cultural understanding and appreciation.
So I found an audio of the Indian Congress from this time, and I've included a link here so we can listen because you know I'm that bitch.
That is so cool. Fuck, that's so awesome. All right.
I strive to bring it every time.
At Cummins Indian Congress, Columbia Record, 500 Indians representing 42 tribes, living in teepees, wigwams, and dobe houses, illustrating their primitive ways in the 14th century before the white man came. Visit the pottery makers, blanket weavers, bead and lace workers. Admission, 25 cents.
This is a show meant to engage a wide, broad audience and get people psyched and get discussion going. They understand to some degree the marketing and the kayfabe and the performance and production. They also understand that they are not academics. They're not stuffy professors. And I think that is where they make their message more accessible, but also make it more challenging historically and problematic and difficult for the people that they're featuring, while I'm sure they're doing their best.
Yes. So the following is an excerpt from an article on publicdomainreview.org by Kevin Dan. Ella, do do you want to read? This is a description of this is a little more critical of Cummins.
This is what I've been waiting for. Okay.
Yes.
The Coney Island, quote unquote, Congress, a title consciously chosen to distance Cummins' production from Wild West shows, which Indian reformers saw as undermining their efforts at, quote unquote, civilizing the savages, was itself a conglomeration of counterfeits. A former prospector and cowboy turned Chicago theatrical manager, F.T. Cummins, masqueraded as Chief Lakota, Annie Oakley's rival, Princess Winona, quote unquote, Sioux Indian maiden and champion rifle shot of the world, was really Lillian Frances Smith, the daughter of a Massachusetts Quaker couple who had joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show at the age of 15 in 1886. So, this is just a bunch of fakers.
Yes. So the show Indians, reservation dwellers mostly recruited from the Pine Ridge Agency, were given mock warrior names and biographies: Ghostface, Painted Horse, Standing Soldier, Red Shirt, and Bad Wound.
Red Shirt cannot be a good one.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The highbrow pageant of pottery makers, blanket weavers, and lace workers was but a thin veneer over the frontier violence that the steeplechase audience thrilled to see and hear. A review of Cummins' Congress later that same summer at Madison Square Garden, so that's how big these were, highlighted a reenactment of the capture and lynching of a horse thief and a white captive's running of an Indian gauntlet before being burned at the stake. So that lets you know these whole scenes where they would be reenacting like a train robbery, and participants in the audience would be like, I want to be scalped. I want to be scalped. Like there was a complete disconnect from the brutality of day-to-day life in the frontier, and the colonial violence and all of it was kind of pushed away, and it was all about the spectacle. So yeah,
it's like frontier tourism.
Yes, very much.
Before we move further along, you in the script, you said that the steeplechase audience. What does steeplechase mean?
So after the Pan American, a lot of the rides and events that were there that had been successful were deconstructed and moved over to Coney Island to be like permanent installations.
Mm-hmm.
So Steeplechase Arena was the Coney Island arena. So they're just saying, this is just a review of the show once it landed in Coney Island.
Interesting.
But it's the same show. But now they've removed the word Indian. So now it's just F.T. Cummins Congress instead of F.T. Cummins Indian Congress. And that was about respectability politics, which is now Wild West shows were seen as kind of underneath or beneath him, right? And like they're doing a real show where it's not exploitative.
Mm-hmm.
It's about appreciating Native Americans.
So Cummins decided to bring the Congress to the Pan American Exposition in 1901. At that point, still the Indian Congress. The end of the frontier had created in the American consciousness, or rather settler consciousness, a thirst for all things Wild West and Native. People flocked to Wild West shows to watch sham battles and mock scalpings. People like Buffalo Bill, Geronimo, Sitting Bull, and Annie Oakley were bona fide celebrities. One woman attending the exposition saw that a prominent figure was missing from the lineup and had a plan to fix it. Her name was Josephine Brake, and she was going to find Calamity Jane and bring her to the exposition. She was going to drag that bitch's ass right out here where she belonged.
All right. So here we go.
Okay.
So you've got Josephine Brake is at the Pan Expo. She's watching the Wild West shows, notices that there's a very significant figure missing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing she probably asked around and people were like, I think she's dead. Because everyone did. Because who could live that long? She was drinking rot gut like it was water and like crazy, and living in like ditches and dugouts. And Like, I mean, like people were just like, yeah, there's no way. And even her friends were like, there's no way that girl is still alive. It's not possible. But there was a chance sort of encounter that really cemented this. And so we're going to go back in time a couple years.
Okay.
So we're going to go to 1898. And we're going to go to a man named General Charles P. Egan.
Okay.
If that name is familiar to you. That is the name of the captain that Calamity said she saved his life, and he named her Calamity Jane.
Right. Okay, that's why.
Right. Okay. And then that Captain Egan's wife later said, like, first of all, he died. And she said, no, Calamity Jane, like, never saved him. He, like, never knew her. And they're like, oh, she must have just made the whole thing up.
Mm-hmm.
This Captain Egan was the commissary officer, and she often worked in commissary when she was joining the army, suffered an intense injury that he had for the rest of his life during the lava bed wars, which she would have been present at. So we're going to go back a few years to the Spanish-American War in 1898. So this is like 3 years before. So the Spanish-American War was a conflict between the United States and Spain that took place in 1898. It was primarily fought over issues related to Cuba's struggle for independence from Spanish colonial rule. And during that war, there were reports of soldiers receiving substandard and spoiled food supplies, including canned beef. The quality and safety of these rations were a cause for concern.
Little throwback. I bet botulism might have been a concern.
It absolutely was. A lot of people died.
Yeah.
It was it was a very serious problem.
Horrifying, huge death rate.
Yeah.
The U.S. government had contracted with several meatpacking companies to supply canned meat for the military. These companies included Armour and Company and Swift and Company.
They were very big companies. These were not fly-by-night companies, is what's important. Is they, at the time, these were like very big, reputable.
Okay. The consumption of spoiled and low-quality food had negative effects on the health of American soldiers. Shocking nobody today, I'm sure. But many soldiers suffered from illnesses such as food poisoning, dysentery, and other ailments related to poor nutrition. The conditions faced by American soldiers and the poor quality of their supplies led to public outcry and criticism. The scandal was widely covered by newspapers and magazines, and it fueled public indignation. One of the whistleblowers was a general named Charles Patrick Egan. Egan was a career military officer who served in the United States Army. He had served under Crook during the lava bed wars. Crook, I assume, is a velociraptor, probably.
George Crook. Remember we talked about him. So George Crook was the general that Jane was sort of following all over the place.
Right. And it makes sense now that he was a velociraptor. I get it now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Totally.
He served under Crook during the lava bed wars, where he was permanently injured during a conflict. He held the rank of major and was stationed in Tampa, Florida during the Spanish-American War. He served as the commissary officer responsible for provisioning the troops stationed in Tampa. So he was the officer in charge of feeding motherfuckers. Yeah. As such, he would have been involved in overseeing the procurement and distribution of food supplies to the soldiers.
Yeah. And so now this is where we get like this kind of twist of fate. It's like should only happen in a movie, but is happening in real life, right? In testimony before Congress in December 1898, the refrigerated beef was derisively referred to as embalmed beef due to its odor by the then commanding general of the Army, Major General Nelson A. Miles. General Miles also testified that the canned beef was supplied to the Army under the pretense of an experiment. General Egan took this statement as a personal insult and openly denounced Miles as a liar when called to testify on January 12, 1899. General Egan was quoted in the New York Times. Do you want to guess by who?
Was it our girl who eventually came to make a famous woman out of our girl?
Yeah, she didn't have a byline at the time because they didn't do that, but she was the editor for over 34 newspapers on the Eastern Seaboard.
Quick aside, explain what a byline is.
Byline is what it says by Sovereign Syre, by Ela Darling.
Okay, that's what a byline is.
A lot of times they would just say by reporter.
Right.
By New York Times reporter.
Yeah.
Okay. So General Egan was quoted in the New York Times as saying, in reference to Miles, quote, He lies in his throat. He lies in his heart. He lies with every hair on his head and every pore on his body. He lies willfully, deliberately, intentionally, and maliciously.
As a result of Egan's aspersions towards Miles, who had a long and distinguished military career, as well as being a recipient of the Medal of Honor, he was quickly court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. That's my fetish. And was suspended from duty until he retired on December 6th, 1900, which, holy shit, that is 123 years ago plus about 7 days. As a direct result of General Egan's remarks concerning General Miles, he was denied admission into Pennsylvania Commandery of the Military Order of Foreign Wars. He was also expelled from membership in the District of Columbia Commandery of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States. This is important because Josephine Winfield Brake was a political correspondent in Washington and the editor of over 30 newspapers along the eastern seaboard at the time the story broke, and she would have been familiar with Egan and likely was the one covering the story for the New York Times. So let's just put a little pin in that. And Sabi, who the is Josephine Winfield Brake, and why am I about to fall in complicated love with her?
Oh, you are very going to fall in complicated love with her. Oof. So Josephine Winfield was born in Defiance, Ohio in 1858.
Oh, in Defiance as well as Defiance, Ohio.
Yes. Though her ancestors were among the founders of Cincinnati, she was born into a middle-class family. She did well in school and married fairly young to a dentist named Franklin Brake. The two moved about the Midwest while he got his practice going, and a few years later, she gave birth to their only child, a daughter named Edith. According to Josephine, she was widowed quite soon after and had to earn a living as a journalist. However, looking through old records, it shows that Franklin Brake did not die until 1897. They may have separated much earlier, though. And here is a picture of Josephine Brake from the newspaper. And this is like a very common motif. She's sort of in a toga type situation holding like an urn. And that was like a very kind of sort of post-Victorian aesthetic that they had going on. That's just her. She was featured. She's featured in the paper. Yeah, because she had just written, we'll get into it. She had just written a novel.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick moment and describe this image for the readers. It is a black and white scan of a shitty newspaper photograph that was black and white and shittily scanned to begin with. It's a woman sitting in a sort of leisurely position. She's wearing a very dowdy dress that is cinched around her natural waist and flows naturally down to her ankles, which it flows to the floor so you don't even see her feet. You can barely ascertain the angle of her hips and her thigh based on the way she's sitting. She does hold an urn in her lap. It looks like a very fancy vase. She is sitting in such a way that she looks like a statue herself. She looks blasé. She looks casual. She's sort of coquettishly just resting her face on the ball of her hand, on her like palm, basically. Mm-hmm. She's resting her elbow on this urn. And she's got her other hand just blithely grasping it.
The Grecian, Roman, like there was a lot of romanticization around these things. And so this as a writer would have been like a great fucking portrait.
Yeah.
Right? It would have been like highly sought after. Like girls that wanted to have their pictures taken in a native hairdress, like in the Tumblr era, right? It's like there were certain photos that like, I just want to have the photo.
It has full glam makeup, a cowboy hat that one would gently and awkwardly rest a hand on while wearing a feather boa and looking sort of serenely up just beyond the camera person at JCPenney.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's very much a JCPenney, oh, you have $60.
Yeah. And this picture comes from a review of her debut novel, which we're going to get into. Like, this is like perfect tornado of fate. Right. Like what was going on in each woman's life when they met. Okay. After the death of her husband, which we'll stick a pin in that.
Yeah.
There are reasons why she might have said that she was widowed. It might have just been easier and more respectable. Right.
Yeah.
She became friends with Ella Wheeler Wilcox.
Already love her. Great name.
Yes. Who was the most famous writer and poet of her time. Think of Maya Angelou, and that's who Ella Wheeler Wilcox was. She wrote the famous poem Laugh and the World Laughs with You.
Oh, wow.
Through her connections to Ella, she was able to get work as a journalist and work her way up the ranks to hold an editorial position at several papers. However, her dream was to write a novel.
In the year 1899, two things happened. Her daughter was arrested for larceny, for stealing and pawning a schoolmate's diamond ring, for which Josephine bribed her daughter out of jail and then took her on the run. This same year, Josephine published her first and only novel, The Way It Happened. Sovereign has read it. I have not. Sovereign
I've read
attests.
it. It's pretty overwrought.
The story was about a woman who wants to be an artist and is beset on all sides by horrible men. Okay, already pretty natural, pretty relatable. The novel was a hit, but also considered quite scandalous and made her something of a laughingstock. It was a thinly veiled autobiography, which must fucking hurt.
Yes. And so basically she was kind of telling her life story. And I found a newspaper article where she's like directly talking about it. And she's like, I made two of the three men were horrible and one was great, which if you look at the proportion of that behavior in society is very generous to men. People thought that made men seem like they were all predators. It was considered very sexual. But they were gonna like make a play out of it, all this kind of stuff. So it was kind of like 50 Shades of Grey.
So it was
where
scandalous,
it was like everyone had read it, but they kind of mocked it. But then they also wanted to make a play out of it. But then so Josephine, like she considers herself like a fucking artist and a badass journalist and this woman that has persevered through incredible odds. She was probably in somewhat of a homosexual relationship with Ella Wheeler Wilcox, who was an Orientalist, which was what they called at that time. These white folks that would get obsessed with Oriental, quote unquote, culture. So that would be like the Middle East, China, India, like kind of a pan-Asian sort of fixation. Right. They would wear turbans and caftans and smoke opium and have orgies and write poems and talk about free love.
Cherry picking from a whole continent, whatever makes them feel cool and makes
that was like the in scene. That was the hipster bohemian scene. That was the dime square of its day.
After the publication of her novel and her daughter's arrest, Josephine found her way to Buffalo, New York for the Pan American Exposition. While there, she came across a story about Calamity Jane being in the poorhouse. She also ran into General Egan, who told her that Calamity Jane had saved his life back in the day. She also met with Frederick T. Cummins of the Indian Congress, quote unquote, and proposed to him that if she brought Calamity Jane back to Buffalo, he would engage her as an act in his show with Josephine Brake acting as her manager. I love that. Pitch the talent you don't have yet. Yeah. So you know how to recruit that talent. Yeah. How are you going to get them on board if you don't have an offer?
Josephine was a hustler. She was out of money. The book had sold a lot, but she needed money. And she saw how much the native players were making in their shows.
Yeah.
And she was like, well, it looks like good money.
Yeah.
I could go get her. And now Josephine was no fucking shrinking violet. She had spent time in barracks, right? I have found the newspaper articles of her staying with men in barracks and reporting on what soldiers' life was like. Like she was not shy at all.
Right. When I say fake it till you make it, like she was the pioneer of that.
Yeah,
she
like
literally
she was in her element. She was in her hustle. 100%.
Love to fucking see it.
Yeah. Like, can you imagine? Like, I heard this person's in like the Philippines on a private island. I'm just going to go find them. Like that would be today's equivalent. Yeah.
The feminine instinct to just go and ask questions until you get where you're trying to go.
Yeah. So Josephine arrived in Livingston, Montana a few days later, where she was accompanied by Dell Anderson, editor of the Livingston Post, on a pursuit to find Calamity Jane. They found her rather quickly. She was living in a tent with a black woman. That's all they said with the negress. They didn't elaborate at all at this relation. I'm assuming it was probably another sex worker that was her homie. Like,
Yeah.
I'm imagining that was probably another member of the Rolling Scum, most
This
likely.
unnamed woman I recognize has come up, unless, I feel like this time in her life has been referenced a few times. And so this particular woman we don't know what their relationship was.
Yeah.
But
I was guessing it was probably a lover
I would assume
that was taking
so.
care of her. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, there was never anything explicit about Jane's sexuality, but given what Dora Dufran used to say about she was amoral, and there were lots of things like she used to dance with the women just like she was a man, you know? So I think that there was a lot of nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Yeah.
Like Jane is very pliable and doesn't really worry too much about what other people think. And,
Right, well,
you know?
also, just historically, think of all of the women being documented with their good friend.
Yes. Boston marriages, as they say.
Boston marriages.
Yeah, because that's where all the blue stockings were. So women in Boston that were intellectuals and scholars would live together like sisters. And they used to call it a Boston marriage because no one was willing to say that they were fucking.
Okay,
Yeah.
beautiful.
So she was living in a tent with a black woman that was taking care of her in Horror. Haha, no pun intended. A settlement near Graveyard Bottoms in Yellowstone.
That's
Joseph-
HORR. Just
Yeah.
so you know.
And this is like they call it Graveyard Bottoms because when they first got there were a lot of Native American graveyards in this area, kind of in the bottom of Yellowstone.
Okay.
So that's where that name comes from.
Gruesome.
Yeah. Josephine offered to bring Jane back to Buffalo and take care of her in luxury for the rest of her life. Depending on the source, Jane either rebuffed Josephine's advances or fell into a weeping heap, happy to be saved.
I have my guesses.
Yeah. I'm inclined to believe the former.
Yeah.
Josephine stayed around a few days, and despite Jane's friends trying to talk her out of it, Jane agreed to go with Josephine to Buffalo, New York. What Josephine's real intentions were is a mystery. Whether she genuinely wanted to accommodate Jane's retirement or whether she simply wanted to put her on display at the expo and reap the profits. Like, no one can be sure. We just have to guess. On her journey to Montana, Josephine told one reporter her intention was to write a biography of Jane. With her debut novel having turned into something of a scandal and a joke, she may have been eager to write something that would guarantee success, and Calamity Jane was still a figure of great fascination to the civilized people of the East.
Whatever her motivations, they made their first stop in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Josephine bought Jane a new wardrobe of fine gowns and hats. But there was a tension from the start. Jane was always drunk, which seemed to make Josephine anxious, clearly. And after Jane got new clothes, there was an incident where she came down from her room, her face covered comically in face powder that was also all over the front of her new gown, which I'm already offended about because that was probably a very expensive gown.
Yeah.
A lot to make. It's not easy to, where's the closest dry cleaner, Calamity?
Yeah.
It was supposed to be a mockery of Josephine's attempts to civilize her. Jane spent the night gambling, drinking, and smoking cigars, something that would have been completely offensive to a well-heeled lady like Josephine, but was clearly just like a Tuesday for Jane.
Yeah. Yeah.
Additionally, Jane hated reporters, as we've established.
Yes.
She was constantly mocked by journalists over her exploits and her alcoholism. So knowing this, Josephine colluded with a reporter in St. Paul. They said the reporter was Josephine's cousin that wanted to meet Jane. During their meeting, a reporter for a rival paper appeared and asked if he too could come have an interview since she was talking to a reporter. This caused Jane to fly into a rage, and she beat the reporter with her satchel so badly that the satchel was damaged during the scuffle. And for the rest of the trip, she would show it to reporters trying to ask her questions as evidence of what she would do to them if they tried to interview her.
Yeah. So, like, you see this duplicity in Josephine, right? Like this kind of that she clearly had an idea of what was going to happen on this trip. And then Jane was like not falling in line with that plan. And so Josephine's like, I want to get some press for this, but she won't talk to reporters. I know what I'll do. And Jane just like was not having it, you know? So there was like immediately there was tension between these two people, right? But like kind of in for a dime, in for a dollar.
This particular incident reminds me of an incident from my childhood where I ran to my parents to tattle on my brother because I had this really cool, if you were born in the 80s and you are a sparkly girl, it was this wand that had like a gel-like substance with a bunch of sparkles in it. So it would slowly.
I had one.
Yeah.
I had one.
So I went to my parents to tattle on my brother because he broke my wand. This motherfucker had the audacity to have a head in the way when I slammed it over his head, and his stupid head caused it to break. And so he broke my fucking wand. And that was unconscionable. And I stand by that to this day.
Hey, hard head makes a soft ass.
Could you please explain that?
Well, you know, when you tenderize meat, you beat the shit out of it. So if you're hard-headed, you get your ass beat a lot. So a hard head makes a soft ass. And when people grab my butt and they go like, oh, I love your ass, it's so big and soft. And I'm always like, because I'm hard-headed. Because I done took a lot of, I done took a lot of whoopings. Oh my God.
Oh, no doubts, no aspersions cast. And also, I just want to say once again, I just love how much I learned from you. Okay, so yeah,
yeah. All right.
She just didn't like him. She just didn't have a fondness for the reporters.
She terrified these fucking people. Like she was, you know, she was like, hey, I'm a real person. Oh.
She burglarized the Fourth Estate.
Yeah, she was just like, go fuck yourself. All right.
Yeah, good for her.
So a few days later, the two women arrived in Buffalo, New York. Josephine was renting a house there, a manor called Our House, that she was sharing with her mother. Her daughter had recently eloped with a jewelry salesman and was in the wind. Jane and Josephine were greeted by Frederick T. Cummins, General Egan, and Ella Wheeler Wilcox. And they all took Jane to see Niagara Falls. And by the end of that visit, Jane had signed a contract to perform at the exposition, with all her proceeds going to Josephine, who would give her a small stipend. And also accommodations. But at the house, Jane was not allowed to drink and had a curfew.
That is more of an affront than taking her money. Taking her agency. Taking her control over her own shit. Like,
it's also just this kind of arrogance of like, this is a woman that has been fucking feral since she was 12 years old, has survived in a brutal blood meridian world. Like Cormac McCarthy could not write darker than she has seen, right?
Right.
And this woman thinks that by simply putting some prohibitions down and managing Jane's money, she's going to manage Jane. And that is going to bite her in the ass like so fucking hard.
This feels like it was written in a writer's room. Honestly.
It really does.
The hoity-toity journalist who thinks she's going to tame the untamable. And on top of that, playing fast and loose with her finances, like that. Yeah. That's a classic move. I get that. But
I mean, to be fair, we've seen what Jane does with money. So I understand the impulse. I 100% understand the impulse to be like, I'm going to manage your money because you cannot.
Yeah, I don't fault her for that. It's really trying to tell her when and how like this woman has gone through
the irony of being like, you can't drink and you have a curfew when it's like, bitch, you are most likely eating Ella Wheeler Wilcox's pussy while being fucking noshed out of your mind on fucking opium and shit. Like, y'all are having orgies on Millionaire's Row, and there's not a doubt in my mind Josephine was like fucking part of that. So there's also like a kind of hypocrisy going on because it's like, you know.
None of that would have happened if not for Jane's absolute feral bullshit. Like, trying to tell her she can't drink and she has a curfew now is basically curtailing any further development of this story, if you want to think of it from a really shitty perspective, which I will. But just fuck it. Like, money comes, money goes. I relate to that. I'm a hoe who has dated some very problematic individuals, but don't fucking tell me how to use my body or my time or, the comfort of my efforts. Like, at the end of the day, you can take a really shitty percentage and that's going to suck. If I have sovereignty over myself, if I have agency and self-determination, I can put up with a lot. And that's where people go wrong, when they start to take that away, obviously. And this is where she got a little too big for her britches, it seems like.
Yeah, but exactly. So when they get back, there's like a large dinner that was held for her at the Iroquois Hotel. And it was a dinner for lady journalists, newspaper women, as they were called in the parlance of the time. And it was packed. And a sober Jane was actually quiet through the whole evening. I even found like the recipes from this shit. And it's like canapes and this and that. And I'm like, this is a woman that eats like hardtack and fucking canned beans. It must have been crazy to be at this dinner where she's being served like truffles and canapes and salmon. And like, I found a menu for this dinner. So a sober Jane was quiet through the whole evening. She was in her early 40s, but looked much older due to her life of hard drinking. However, the next day, she drove a train of 40 mules through the city to the exposition, did it flawlessly, and then performed alongside Geronimo and Princess Winona and the rest of the Indian Congress. So this woman just got out of the poorhouse.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's dying.
Yeah.
And she, at the party, they're like, she's going to drive 40 mules, a train of 40 mules through the city. And she fucking does it and does it flawlessly.
Explain what that means. Because when you say
have
that,
you ever been
I'm
on a
so
horse?
removed.
So you've been on a horse?
No. I'm a scared girl who has only one spine to my name.
So imagine that fear.
Yeah.
So she's on a horse and she has 40 mules in front of her. And she's going to drive all of them by herself.
So essentially herding 40 individual creatures on horseback.
Through the major thoroughfare of the city.
Okay.
She's going to do it. She's going to do it with style. She's going to, like, people were like, it was impeccable. Like, it was just like the ability of this woman to harness and corral that much energy and have it do a straight shot to the fucking grounds of the exposition.
I, even with all of that, cannot possibly imagine what it took to corral 40 individual animals to do that thing. But I respect that it was fucking amazing.
So Sitting Bull had passed away at this time already, but the big thing was to have these big kind of figures from the American Indian Wars as part of these shows. And so the one that was on the show with her was Geronimo. So we're going to talk a little bit about who that was and why that was so like significant. And
so Geronimo is a name that you've probably heard, and for a lot of people, you might not even realize that it is, in fact, a name. Geronimo was born around 1829 in what is now Arizona. He was a member of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, which was part of the larger Apache nation. He became a respected leader within his tribe, known for his skills as a warrior and strategist. He earned a reputation for his ability to elude capture by both Mexican and American forces. His people faced encroachments on their traditional lands by Mexican and American settlers, as well as conflicts with other Native American tribes and the U.S. military. Geronimo led them in a series of raids and battles in an effort to protect their territory and way of life. Geronimo surrendered to U.S. authorities multiple times, only to escape from captivity and resume his resistance. Fucking baller.
Yeah. Yeah.
His ability to evade capture and his reputation as a fierce warrior contributed to his legendary fucking status. That's why, like, his name, even if you don't know his story.
That's why you scream his name before you jump out of a plane. It's like he was known for this kind of just bravery and chutzpah that
He's become like the non-Catholic patron saint of having a solid sack behind you.
Yeah.
In 1886, 100 years before I was born, Geronimo and his remaining followers surrendered to General Nelson Miles. Sovereign, why does that sound so familiar?
Because that was the general of the U.S. Army that got called out by Mr. General Egan during that tainted beef scandal.
Aha.
Yeah.
And this marked the end of Geronimo's active resistance. The U.S. government exiled Geronimo and his people to reservations in Florida, Alabama, and later, Oklahoma.
So Geronimo spent his later years as a prisoner of war and a celebrity, which is crazy. Like to be, much like Sitting Bull was, like super famous and then also detained.
Both of those situations are mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Like to fathom that life journey is...
These people became like Snowden or Mandela. They're freedom fighters, but they're imprisoned, and they kind of occupy this strange space where they're between kind of two worlds. They are suppressed because they are imprisoned, but their message and their movement is still going on very strong outside of that prison.
As today, I think we look towards those people to give us not just information and understanding that they are lending to a scenario involving a government that we're not privy to. We also have this expectation of entertainment from it. It can't simply be a knowledge dump. It can't just be a side observation of our culture. It has to be something with a narrative that entertains. Yeah. Because anything that dominates the news cycle needs to be a story. It can't just be facts.
Yeah.
And back then, that was just the name of the game. That narrative is what made it so that you keep doing the thing you were doing.
It's also like the spoils of war. Indians are savages until they're defeated. And then when they're no longer a threat, then we start to build this narrative of the noble savage, of the celebrity warrior, right? Because they're no longer a threat. So Geronimo spent his later years as a prisoner of war and a celebrity of sorts, and he made public appearances, often participating in events that depicted Native American life, including Frederick Cummins Congress. So compensation for Native American players could range from a few dollars to more substantial amounts, depending on their roles and prominence within the show. So Geronimo and Sitting Bull, they would have been paid pretty handsomely. Mm-hmm. Performers who took more central and visible roles within the show, such as sharpshooters, writers, or dancers, were often paid more than those who had supporting or background roles. Yes.
It has been a tool of the employers, the people who employ labor, to obscure your value and how much they're willing to pay you in spite of your value, and insist that you obscure that from other people. Because if the laborers share the information about their value to the employer, then they can unify and they can make group demands of things.
Yes, they become powerful.
So the terms of the performers' contracts could significantly impact their earnings. Still today.
Yes.
Some performers negotiated their own terms, while others had little bargaining power and were subject to the decisions of show managers and promoters.
Nothing has changed.
Nothing.
No.
I wonder how many of them are like promising they'll make you famous if you suck their dick.
All of them.
All of them. Yeah, some things never change. In addition to payment, some performers had their travel, accommodation, and basic needs covered by the show. However, these expenses could also be deducted from their pay.
Some things never change.
Some things never change. Some Native American performers were exploited by show managers who took advantage of their lack of familiarity with the show business and economic disparities.
Some
we don't need to
never
say
change.
it again, but we're gonna.
Yep.
Like, these performers might have received very low pay in relation to the profits generated by the shows. We just had a whole strike about it.
Yeah,
we just had a bunch of strikes about all this. One widely cited story is that Geronimo was initially promised $25 per week, which would be about $1,000 in today's money for his participation in the show. However, he reportedly encountered difficulties in receiving his full payment. There are accounts suggesting that he was not paid as promised and that his earnings were instead held in trust by the U.S. government.
And that is something that was very common in these Wild West shows. That, well, they don't know how to manage money.
That narrative holds true in museums across the world. And I say this specifically having watched the John Oliver Last Week Tonight episode very recently about the way that museums hold artifacts that belong to other countries, and the way especially British museum people talk about, well, we would let them have it back as soon as they can demonstrate that they know how to take care and responsibility of the things they already have.
So this is also setting us up for like Jane's relationship with Josephine. Like, you know what I mean? It's like the same kind of paternalistic, I'm going to be in control of everything. So I wanted to include, like, one of the people she performed alongside was Princess Winona. And I wanted to talk a little bit about her because I wanted to cover this aspect of shows, just so you get a sense of like what kind of community made up these shows. Princess Winona was Lillian Frances Smith, who was born in Colville, California. Her parents were Quakers. She was a good shooter. She began shooting at the age of 7, was competing by the age of 10. And at the age of 15, she joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which was like the biggest one. They were touring Europe. They were all over the place. And that's where she met her rival, Annie Oakley. So her and Annie were like never on friendly terms, but Smith was like, thought she was better than Annie Oakley and kind of actively was like, I'm going to outshoot you. Like, I'm going to be the bigger star. Lillian was young. She had huge tits. She was a shameless flirt. She had big ambitions and lived very out loud. And Annie Oakley was the girl next door. Annie was very Jennifer Aniston and Lillian was very Angelina Jolie, right? And Lillian was like, I'm going to outpace you. And they both ended up being part of the Wild West show when they performed in front of Queen Victoria in England. And Lillian didn't perform that well. She just didn't stand up to her own hype. Basically, like she talked herself up. They get to England and she fucks up during her performance, which leads to the press like fucking mocking the shit out of her because she had talked such a big game. And like essentially, Annie Oakley was like, get her the fuck out of here. And Buffalo Bill fired her. You know, because it's like this like fucking kid thinks she's going to be whatever. Well, she's very ambitious. So in 1901, Lillian joins the Indian Congress performing as Princess Winona, a Sioux princess. She wore traditional Sioux clothing, colored her hair black, and wore tan makeup to darken her skin. She was in red face.
Wow.
And that is one of the big draws to the Wild West show. So the natives aren't necessarily getting paid very well. You've got a lot of people in red face. She was certainly not the only one. Cummins himself was like, I'm General Lakota. And it's like, no, you're not.
Right.
No, you're not.
It's just very farcical.
Yeah. But so just to give you an idea, like these are the kind of people that occupy this world and they're judging Jane for being a whore.
She's fucking not. She is literally living her best life authentically. She's self-actualized as fuck. She's not pretending to be anything, even literate. Yes. Which, by the way, a 3-page pamphlet, autobiography, you mentioned the brevity of it. Let's not forget the fact that a lot of that was probably pictures. So we're really looking at like 1-page single space, probably double spaced.
Yeah, it's very brief. It's very brief.
Admirable. Jane's performances consisted of her trick writing, sharpshooting, and telling stories of her life. She was illiterate all her life, and her memoir had been ghostwritten for her, like we said, 3-page pamphlet, probably with lots of pictures, that she would sell along with autographed photos of herself. By all accounts, she was still a great performer. At first, she was only keeping a few bucks a day for herself, with the rest going to Josephine to manage. But Jane lasted about 2 weeks in the way things were, which is longer than I anticipated.
Yeah.
Having anybody standing over her, telling her how and what to do.
Yeah.
Josephine was lucky she was pretty.
Yeah, it was.
An old friend that was at the expo ran into her, and she characterized her relationship with Josephine as being kept prisoner. With encouragement from her old friend, she negotiated her own contract with Cummins, where she kept all her money and cut ties with Josephine. As soon as Jane was able to keep her own money, she was arrested for drunken disorderly and getting into a fight with a cop. She appeared at her next show and joked that it was the first time she'd ever been arrested.
Gotta love our girl.
Fucking A. Yeah. Takes it, rolls with it, makes it a joke, makes more money from it.
The first day she has her own money, she's arrested for drunken disorderly and beating up a cop.
After my own heart.
That's my girl.
Yeah.
So at this time, she became infatuated with a farmer who she had met at the expo named Frank Darlington.
Oh.
It's in the name. Okay. I can tell you about the Darlings. Just stay away. When it became clear.
Bitch.
Cut. Well, but Josh Darling.
Okay. He came by it honestly. I fabricated it for myself.
Yeah, his was real.
That.
Yeah. So when it became clear he did not return her affection, she went on a 3-day bender, which ended in a riot outside the expo, and she was kicked out of the city.
And she was like, bitch, they did this when I was 9. Spin me a new one.
Yeah, exactly. Frank Darlington appeared to take care of her, and they disappeared for a few weeks. But soon enough, she was back on her own.
He could not handle that pussy.
Yeah. No. So during this time, Buffalo Bill had arrived in Buffalo and was putting on his own show near the expo. So after one of his shows, she arrived in his tent and told him she needed money to get back to Montana. He gave her $50, about $2,000 in today's money, and wished her luck. It was the last time he would see her. She made it as far as Chicago before she ran out of money. So that lets you know how much of a drunk she was. She made it from Buffalo to Chicago on a train that's like a day or two and was already out of money.
Oh, man. See, you factored in the train being present at this time because I was going to go back to like, that seems like a long time. But no,
Yeah.
Okay.
She managed to sign with a dime museum there in Chicago and perform to make enough money and get started on the rest of the journey home.
Well, Jane made her way back to the Black Hills over the next 2 years.
That's how long it took her.
That's what I'm saying. That's why it's like she made it.
She'd get so faced and she'd run out of money, and then she'd have to stay in a town and just like hook until she could make more money to get to the next town. So going at that pace, it took her 2 years to get home.
So like 2 years, that just sounds like a Wizard of Oz. Like it sounds like Dorothy getting caught in the poppy fields to me. And you know what? It happens to the best of us, Dorothy included. So, while she made her way back over the next 2 years, no shade, Josephine began to petition the government to give Jane a pension in recognition of her service to the country as a scout. This created a large public debate about whether helping Jane would only hinder her and whether she was ever really a scout or simply a drunk, good at telling tall tales. Josephine even made it to Chicago in search of Frank Rouard, who might affirm that Jane did in fact serve as a scout. How it was that Frank Rouard never surfaced is a mystery, as he became quite famous in his dotage and should have been easy enough to find, but it would also be another several years before newswires were a thing, allowing stories to circulate more widely. So, you know.
I found the old newspaper articles is that Josephine went to Washington, D.C. and took out an ad in the paper saying she was looking for Frank Rouard because she was petitioning for Jane to get a pension.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that if he wasn't in Chicago or he wasn't in New York, there were no newswires yet. So the chances of him seeing that or someone he knew seeing it, do you see what I'm saying? It's like, this was like kind of the limit of communication. So he was quite famous in his own right, but who Josephine was looking for was Frank Gerard, because Jane was illiterate.
So she didn't know how to spell his last name to begin with.
No. So Josephine thought she was looking for a Frank or a Francis Gerard when she was looking for Frank Rouard, who was very fucking famous. Just a tragedy of technology, right?
It feels like putting up a missed connections on Craigslist and then forgetting the color of shirt and style of dress or just not knowing.
Yes.
what the girl was wearing.
Yes.
You're just not going to find anyone that way.
Yeah.
You need more information.
Yes.
After spending about 9 months in Pierre, South Dakota, and visiting old friends, Jane arrived in Billings, Montana. She was arrested and jailed the first night for drunken disorderly. Did I already read this?
No, you didn't already read this. This is just her life.
Sorry. She was once again arrested and jailed the first night at a place for drunken disorderly. She would spend the next year shuffling between medical establishments trying to treat her alcoholism and jail for being drunk and disorderly. She was starting to come undone. Never having been one to pick fights, she chased after a woman with a hatchet after she made fun of her. What was she making fun of? What did she have
She
the
was
audacity
making fun
to
of
talk
her
shit
for
about?
being coarse, and then Jane chased her with a hatchet and tried to kill her. And then she said, I never chased a lady with a hatchet. That bitch wasn't a lady. It was
She
just like
found
a
work
young
as-
girl in town that like didn't like Jane was like, do you know who I am? And she's like, modernity, bitch. You're no one anymore. And that's what Jane was going through, was the frontier had closed. So she's trying to get back home, but she's trying to get back home to a home that doesn't exist anymore. There's no place for her anymore.
Right.
You know, they're all law abiding now. They all go to church. They have stock exchanges on every corner. They have churches on every corner. They have pavement. They have bathrooms. You know, like she doesn't fit anywhere anymore.
So yeah, she found work as a laundress at a brothel run by Flora Dufran, but soon found that the labor of the job was just too much for her to handle in her sickly state. Was she still coming down off of alcohol, or
I mean, she just
impacted by it?
Just impacted by it. I mean,
Right.
it just like she was in liver failure. They said that she had rheumatism.
Mm-hmm.
They said she had which was arthritis, which from
she
all
had the
her
whole shebang.
I mean, it was just like chronic inflammation everywhere.
Right.
She was drinking.
So whether she was drinking day to day or not, she was daily living with the repercussions of decades of that.
She slept under fucking carriages. She lived in dugouts. She hauled wood and worked as a laundress. She for money. She drank not just whiskey. She drank. They call it rot gut for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, she didn't like beer. Like their whole thing, and like used to say that you would have to put her to bed and you'd have to put a bottle of whiskey in bed with her, because if you didn't, you were asking for trouble. Like that would at least keep her down.
Yeah.
For like a few hours.
Yeah.
So yeah. And contemporaries at this time, it's just like everyone knew that this was like the end. Like this was like, it was too much.
She was a product of her time, and her time had moved on without her.
Yeah.
And that's just heartbreaking.
Yeah. So 1903, Jane finally made it to Deadwood. And some of the last photos ever taken of her were taken near Wild Bill's grave by a young photographer that she insisted drink with her and be photographed together with her. He described her as sweating profusely and sickly, but still able to nimbly hike along the path to Wild Bill's grave. And I have included some pictures of her with this gentleman and her by Wild Bill's grave.
She looks drunk.
The fun they're having. She's wearing his hat and he's clearly wearing her florally decorated girl's hat.
I was about to ask why he was wearing such a jaunty hat. But yeah, they totally like in one
like you
photo,
can see like she's loved. She's beloved. Like
yeah. So in the first photo, it's Jane lifting a pint of beer to the camera as though she's toasting you, with a somewhat dour man standing behind her looking uninteresting and irrelevant. And then this very cool dude with a very fun grin on his face. It looks like he was caught halfway through saying something, is wearing this big floral hat tilted down on his head that now I see is clearly hers. And he's got a coat that I don't know, maybe it was correct for the time, but it does make him look like a gangly child wearing his short king daddy's like work coat. And they both just look like they're having a great time.
And you can also see how tall she is. She was like 5'10" at that time. That was crazy tall for a girl. You see how much taller she is than the guy? But then look how tall he was, because he's like towering over her.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of cute.
It almost just makes the other dude look a little prissy. But the next photo is her leaning on a fence that is surrounding a monument that I assume is Wild Bill's grave.
Yes.
She has a look on her face that looks drunk and happy and about to pull one over on you, but in a nice way. She looks like a happy drunk, a friendly drunk.
Yes.
She looks comfortable in her element, and she looks like she's hanging out with her old friend as best she can in the moment, which is definitely me projecting hard.
Yeah. And this is the last photo taken of her alive. 3 weeks later, Jane traveled a few miles away to Terry, where she fell extremely ill, and within a few days she was dead. Her cause of death was listed as inflammation of the bowels. Most likely, it was a result of her lifelong alcoholism. She was 47 years old, and she was buried next to Wild Bill Hickok as a kind of inside joke, which led to the persistent myth that they were lovers or had been secretly married during their lifetimes. This isn't true. They only ever knew each other a few months. And so the way it happened is she was basically on her deathbed, and they were like, let us get Jesse for you. And she said, no, like we're estranged and I don't want it. And then she was dying, and she jokingly said, all I ask is that you bury me next to Wild Bill because he would hate it. And they did.
They just took her seriously.
Yeah.
I love that her legacy is that forever her really funny joke was taken sincerely, and she's just like, you fucking idiots. Did I need it? Apparently I needed to spell it out. Do you know jokes are so much funnier when you explain them, you dipshits?
Yeah. And now the story of her death is really funny in that, so she dies in Terry.
Mm-hmm.
So word goes out, they put her in the wagon, and they're going to like take her back to Deadwood to bury her. And so only a few miles, there's like all these towns in between. And so every time they stop by a saloon, they stop the wagon, they go into the saloon, and they say, Calam's dead. We're taking her to Deadwood. And then everyone would like order around for her, get drunk, and then the whole saloon would leave and go with the wagon.
Damn.
Saloon after saloon. So by the time they got back to Deadwood, there were like hundreds of people like with the wagon, and they're all like drunk as shit. Like they're just fucking loaded. And yeah, she's buried next to Wild Bill. Her daughter, Jessie Oakes, grew up thinking that Jane was her grandmother and didn't discover her true identity until she was an adult. Jessie lived to be in her 80s. She lived in Los Angeles, was a registered Democrat, and never married or had any children. As she said that she didn't see the point.
When did she die?
In like the 60s or 70s, I want to say. Yeah.
Does Calamity Jane have any descendants that we know of today?
She has her sister Lena had several children, and those children did go on to have other children. And she had a cousin, Simon, that married a Native woman, and that family then married intergenerationally Native in Montana. And so so there's a few canaries in like Indian country that kind of are like cousins, right? And then Lena, her sister Lena's children, and they ended up in like Washington area. And then her daughter was raised by and thought that Calamity was her grandmother her whole life. And then in the 40s, she wrote to like a historical society saying that she was trying to get more information about her grandmother, Calamity Jane. And that's when they figured out that had actually been her mother. And she lived her life. She like lived in Los Angeles. I think she married a few times, but never had children. But like was just like, yeah, I don't see the point of like marrying a man. That's dumb. And like when I was looking up her records and everything on Ancestry, I saw that she was in fact a registered Democrat, and she worked as a maid, and she lived in LA, and she died in her 80s with no husband, no kids.
That's fucking amazing.
Yeah.
That is really fucking cool.
And that is the story of Calamity Jane.
We did it.
Such an interesting life, and just like true ho excellence.
Really, really a prophet of poetry, a entrepreneur,
Yes.
a dance hall lady who I've got no more rhymes in me.
Just everything.
She's just the fucking coolest, and she had no
Really
fucks
cool.
to give. She could not be bothered.
She's my
You
hero.
wanna
She's my
bother
hero.
her,
Yeah.
You're gonna get hit or shot because
I just
don't
like,
disrupt.
yeah, like just someone completely actualized.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So sources for today are linked in the show notes. You can watch us on youtube.com/@ill_repute. This script was written by me. It's hosted by me and Ela Darling, produced by Joshua Anderson. If you would like to contact us, illreputepod@gmail.com. We accept compliments. We accept suggestions. We only accept critique if you make it fucking funny. If we have to read through that shit, you need to learn how to tag a joke. Okay? But
we accept
we'll take
gift
it.
cards, but please send 2 so that we can both redeem them at the same time
Yes.
and enjoy them on video together.
Yeah. Do you want to do the follow?
Follow us on Instagram at weareillrepute. I'm at Ela Darling69 on Instagram, and Salvi is at sovereign_Syre. On Twitter, it's at illreputepod. I'm at Ela Darling. Salvi is at sovereign_Syre. On TikTok, it's at illreputepod and at callmesavi. I'm not even going to tell you my username. It's nothing until it is, and then I'll tell you. And on Facebook, I don't know, like Facebook us? Like I would say Google us, but you can't because it's different platform. I don't know. It's there. Honestly, you're not going to go to the Facebook from hearing the podcast. Most likely you're going to come to the podcast from learning about it on Facebook. We don't need to reverse engineer that shit. Go to importantadult.com. Sovereign makes some really cool merchandise. She makes a lot of cool shit. It's not all podcast merch. In fact, most of it isn't. And it's all really fucking cool. I would say the majority of days out of the week, I am wearing a tank top that Sovereign designed. It's really good. It's really funny. And if you're an expensive hoe, stop sleeping on this. And if you're not an expensive hoe, stop sleeping on this because you are only one tank top away from looking like one. And you deserve that.
Yeah, like one of my favorite shirts that I made is just the one that declares luxury item.
Yeah, I am. The only reason I'm not wearing it today is because I know that I wore it like last week or the week before. It's one of my favorites.
I almost I was at the thrift store and my favorite thing is I got a vintage Gluck Gluck 9000 t-shirt.
Wait,
and
you didn't make that?
No, I bought it. And then I found a tuxedo t-shirt and then I cut it up and turned it like into a dickie. Yeah, and I like a shirt I'm going to wear on the podcast soon is I found an oversized SVU t-shirt that's just a huge picture of Olivia Benson, aka Mariska Hargitay. And I feel like she's the secret patronus of the show.